So in this portion of the course, we're going to be focusing on supporting student discourse in OpenSciEd. So what you just completed was a reflection in your journal on these two questions. What kinds of science talk happen most frequently in your science classroom? And also thinking about what kinds of science talk would you like to see students engage in within an OpenSciEd unit? So at this point in time, you may have been thinking about a number of different things. Have you heard teacher-led conversations more often in your classroom? Have you heard student-led conversations in your classroom? Do you have student-to-student conversation? Maybe you are thinking about what kinds of vocabulary students use. Is it scientific, academic vocabulary, or is it more kind of colloquial, everyday vocabulary? A lot of things may have come up as you were doing this reflection. So when we're thinking about scientific discourse specifically, there are a couple things that come to mind. It's a little bit different to think about scientific discourse versus other types of discourse. So this is a quote from NSTA. It says, "Discourse is the verbal exchange of ideas or simply talking. Scientific discourse involves argumentation based on evidence to persuade colleagues or classmates that ideas are valid. The NGSS calls for science learning to be mediated by productive argumentation, supported by evidence, collaboration, and analysis." So this idea of supporting your discourse with evidence and trying to persuade someone based on an analysis that you've done, working with other people, is a little bit different with science. Also in science, skill and persistence are required to help students grasp the difference between scientific argument, which rests on plausibility and evidence and has the goal of shared understanding and everyday argument, which relies on power and persuasiveness and assumes the goal is winning. So that is not what we're trying. We're not trying to win in this particular situation. We want to actually persuade someone that based on the evidence that we have in our analysis and our shared understanding that this makes sense. So our goal is a little bit different. And it can be very challenging as teachers to achieve this in the classroom. So we want to think about how we can support scientific discourse and also make sure that we are supporting equitable sense making. That's another big goal for OpenSciEd. Some of you may be familiar with Brian Brown's work. Science in the City is a very accessible book for teachers to look at about his research into discourse and language use in the classroom. And so it's been very important for him to think about what language students naturally use and how do teachers perceive different types of language as more or less valid, perhaps, and how does that influence equitable sense making in the classroom? So these are some quotes from him. First, all students know things. However, they may not express their knowledge in academic language. And as teachers, it's important that we recognize that sometimes we really value academic language or scientific vocabulary over other types of language, but students may understand concepts without using academic language, and we need to make sure that we are aware of that. If we fail to recognize the diverse nature of language and cognition, students who bring a wealth of knowledge but communicate it in vernacular language will never be heard because the nature of classroom conversations privileges only one type of communication. So again, it's important that we recognize that there are multiple ways to express what we know, and we need to validate that all of those ways of communication are important. Really, our goal is that we want to hear and support the brilliance of students as they make sense of phenomena during classroom discussions. So we want to hear from everybody. We don't want to emphasize academic language, and oftentimes based on Brian Brown and others' research, actually academic language in OpenSciEd materials comes later. We don't front load vocabulary. It's something that we develop concepts first, and then we assign terminology to it later on. So why is discourse so central to OpenSciEd? OpenSciEd curricula relies on classroom culture of public reasoning to build students' science ideas across a unit. Being able to identify and support productive talk is an important part of building this culture. So we want our classroom to be a space where students feel like they can speak about what's on their mind and they're not embarrassed if they're wrong, that we hear from everybody and get all these ideas out there. And so productive talk allows students to make their thinking public in an equitable way, allows them to reason about complex ideas, and to develop arguments and evidence-based explanations. We want all of those things to happen. So in order to support this idea that we're figuring things out together, we have this productive talk. There are 4 conditions that we want to have in place. And so we can express these as goals, but we recognize that they're also a challenge to actually implement all of these. So the first goal is to help individual students share, expand, and clarify their own thinking. So as teachers, we want all students to be able to express what they know, use the language that is comfortable for them, that they're okay sharing, and it's okay to make mistakes. So all individually, they feel like they can do that. Goal 2 is to help students listen carefully to one another. So they're not just listening to the teacher, they're not just speaking to speak, they're actually listening to what other people are saying. That is something that we want them to do, and to make sure that they're hearing from everybody and recognizing that their peers have important ideas. We want to help students deepen their reasoning. So they need to really dig into the evidence and reasoning and models and take some time to get past just superficial ideas. And then we want them to understand why they think what they think, and what they do and do not understand, and be able to articulate that. And finally, we want them to help students think with others. So collaborative learning is very important, and moving our science thinking forward together is something that happens with OpenSciEd materials. So in order to accomplish this, this is why teaching is such a skilled activity, is we need to think about how we can accomplish those goals. So if you go back to Canvas, there is a document called the Goals and Talk Moves handout. If you want to just take a moment to open up a copy of that, you can always hit pause on the video to do that. And once you have this resource, we'd like you to take some time to read through it and look at some of the examples of what it might look like if you're trying to achieve goal number 1, for example. So if you're trying to help individual students share, expand, and clarify their own thinking, it may be as simple as just giving them some more time to think. That wait time is very important because some students process faster than others. It might be asking something like, can you say more? What do you mean by that? Can you provide an example? So just spend a little bit of time reading through this. And again, pause the video if you feel like you need to. After you have finished reading through the productive talk goals and moves, we'd like you again to spend some time reflecting in your personal journal and think about which of these goals is most in place in your own classroom right now, and which goal is least in place in your own classroom right now. And you can think about, what you might want to be doing as you move forward. Again, pause the video if you need some additional time to write. So again, as we're thinking about actually being able to implement these talk goals and moves, it really is a difficult thing to do. It's something that takes a number of years perhaps to master as an educator. We're always getting better at this. And in the next section, what we're going to be doing is looking at where in OpenSciEd these talk goals and moves might come into play and what kind of support you're given. And you will also get a chance to see a teacher use this, and then we're going to experience it together when we get together at our next meeting as well. So in OpenSciEd, there are 3 main discussion types, which you're going to read about. There are initial ideas discussions, building understanding discussions, and consensus discussions. And they're all slightly different. They have different goals, and there are different moves that teachers might make based on what the goal of the discussion is. And these discussions will happen throughout the storyline. So you'll do this over and over again. So students will become more and more familiar with these different styles of discussion. So next you're going to read about these different discussion types and see some examples. And then you'll have an opportunity to see an instructor actually enact some of these one discussion type and look for the talk moves that she's using.